Matt Bruenig of the People's Policy Project and the Matt Bruenig YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us, man. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. So I've been watching a bunch of your stuff on YouTube. By the way, welcome to the YouTube game. I know you're relatively new to the YouTube game.
Thank you. I'm coming for you guys.
Good. Do that. And, please do.
I find your stuff very insightful and very interesting. So I wanted to talk first. You released a great video called, I think it's like, describing socialism through corporate governance, something to that effect. So when most people talk about socialism, colloquially, you know, a lot of people just mean government, like when the government does stuff. So Medicare, the VA, the police, the fire department. It's a common refrain you've heard from many people, like, oh, that, you know, these are socialist institutions. That's one way of conceptualizing it. And of course, the more academic way is social ownership of the means of production. Do you view both of these conceptions as legitimate? Is one more legitimate than another? Or, in other words, give us your own definition of socialism.
Yeah, you know, on the socialist canon, I think if you sum it all up, it's basically worker or social ownership of the means of production. And then there are a variety of forms that can take. So in the video you're talking about, I mentioned state-owned enterprises, which include some of the things you talked about, whether that's libraries, public schools, fire departments, where, you know, you have a structure where you have a public owner, and then all the production occurs with the public owner, and there's like a professional manager and all that kind of stuff. But then you have other forms that you can kind of meld onto that. So a worker co-op is a good example of that, where instead of having shareholders or instead of having the CEO own the company themselves, the workers will own the company, will own the shares, and they'll appoint the board and appoint the CEO. I also go into consumer co-ops, which are, and you know, I'm not sure exactly how to classify those, but it's the same kind of idea as a worker co-op, except instead of having the workers in each company control the shares and appoint the board, you have the consumers of that company control the shares and appoint the board. And then you can have wealth funds that will just own the shares of the company, whether those are wage earner funds or social wealth funds. So all these structures basically get at the idea of having workers or society more generally own the productive enterprises in society. So I kind of call them all socialistic in one way or another. And that's how I see what we're trying to do, to move away from kind of shareholder capitalist ownership to these other kinds of forms.
Yeah, and you know, one of the points you stressed is that a lot of times when people think about socialism, many young people, many people on the left, they think of it as like this sort of crazy revolutionary thing, maybe violent. And the essence of your video was like, well, if we actually get into the specifics, it could be a totally sort of dry thing to go from one step, take the next step, and then boom, you're in socialism, and then it's nothing crazy, you know?
Yeah, you know, I think it's funny kind of, you know, with any political movement, you have sort of the substantive texts and proposals, and then it also sits within a specific culture. And, you know, if you're thinking about socialism of 100 years ago or 150 years ago, you have people writing in it who, you know, we would think of as kind of basically like dorks and wonks. And I mean, if you ever read Karl Marx's book, you know, Capital, his main one, he's tallying up things like the number of factories in Ireland and stuff like that. It's like a whole other game. It's like a spreadsheet exercise almost. But over time, I think it has drifted more towards a kind of youthy, angsty subculture in much of the West. And so that has kind of changed some of the impression people have about it. But, you know, ultimately, like what it looks like is going to be a change in corporate governance, which may or may not be all that exciting at the end of the day for people who, you know, are kind of romantically attached to it in a kind of revolutionary zeal kind of way.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that you really draw out is it's also not like you just flip a switch and it's like, this is capitalism and this is socialism. There's actually a lot of gray area and debates over, for example, whether the Scandinavian countries should count as socialist societies or not. And so thinking of that in the U.S. context, you're sort of advocating for the possibility of an incremental socialism. What do you think is the most clear-cut path to increasing the socialism dial or upping the socialism dial reading in the United States?
Yeah, you know, I think of three main institutions. You have state-owned enterprises, you have social wealth funds, and then you have worker co-ops or consumer co-ops of one sort or another. And there are a lot of ways you can go. So we were doing some papers on this at PPP at the moment, but one kind of interesting development we've seen in the last few years is something like a dozen different cities have opened up municipal grocery stores. And this has tended to happen in rural areas where the main grocery chain has just kind of left town because it's not really profitable anymore because it's kind of a small community. And so they just create a, they move out, the city buys the lot, and then they just run like a city-owned grocery store. So something like that is, you could kind of take that model and expand it and expand it and expand it. And it's not like the stuff in the store is free or whatever, but, the business charges money, it breaks even. I think it's, in many of these places, it's a little bit profitable. But what's interesting about the profits, of course, is when it's city-owned, the profits flow into the city's budget, and then they can use those to pay for services instead of going to the pockets of shareholders. So that's a kind of state-owned enterprise model, just trying to find ways to just create these public enterprises where it makes sense to do it and where it's easy to do it. Social wealth funds, Alaska has one, North Dakota has one. Basically, just pool a bunch of assets on a state level and go out and buy as many stocks and bonds as you can. And then for worker co-ops, there are a lot of things you can do essentially to preference those kinds of institutions. They already exist to some extent, but tax breaks, public financing to help workers buy out the companies. We're going to have a lot of retirements soon, as you probably know. So there are actually going to be a lot of businesses that need to be bought out by somebody, because their owner is going to retire, and it's not really maybe something that they can just go sell out onto the public market. So the government could facilitate that exit by helping workers finance the purchase of those companies. So things like that.
So one of the things I find interesting about your philosophy is that you are a big advocate of state-owned enterprises. And I feel like a good way to conceptualize this is there are some people who are socialists who believe in like a statist model of socialism, which would be state-owned enterprises. And then there's like an anti-statist model of socialism, which would be more like worker-owned co-ops, bottom up, just take an individual productive unit entity and then socialize that, like socialize a company. Can you explain to everybody why it is you prefer more the statist model of socialism, why you prefer more of the state-owned enterprise route as opposed to worker co-ops? I know you're not an opponent of worker co-ops, but I know you happen to prefer state-owned enterprises over worker co-ops.
Yeah, so if you think about a worker co-op, you would take a company, and it's only the workers in that firm that get to own the company and have some say about what it does. With the state-owned enterprise, the government, which is elected by everyone, it gets to kind of pull the levers at the top. And so I tend to prefer this just as a general matter, right? I don't think the only people who have an interest in how a specific company operates is the workers in that firm. There's also the consumers, there's also the public generally. If the firm is polluting, that hurts everyone. So I think everyone has an interest in how companies operate. And so if you only operate, with the workers in each firm, you exclude a lot of people. There are also a lot of people who don't work at any given time, right? You have people who are retired, people who are disabled, people who are stay-at-home parents. And, those folks, I think, should also be involved in the governance of the economy, or at least have some say through their vote in government. Aside from that, worker co-ops, I think, are a little bit, they're a little bit ill-fitting to the way people actually navigate work. People don't stay in the same job over and over again for the rest of their lives. The average person, I think, switches jobs over 10 times between the time they start, enter the workforce and exit, and in their 50s and 60s. And so I'm not sure they really have an attachment to this specific company they work for, nor am I sure that we want to encourage them to have an attachment to the companies they work for. I think we want people to move between companies if they see better opportunities or jobs open that they would be good at doing. And if we tie them to the firm they happen to work for, then that is cut down. So I think a social ownership makes more sense. There's also an intermediate stage way of doing this, which mid-century Sweden attempted for a little bit, which is you could have all the workers in each sector own all the companies in each sector. So like all the grocery store workers would own all the grocery stores through like a collective fund. So, you can kind of mix and match these things as you see fit. But I tend to think as society-wide as you can make it is the preferable kind of way to structure it.
Matt, there was a bipartisan proposal recently, I'm sure you saw, to create a social wealth fund to fund Social Security. What did you think of that idea, and how does that fit into some of the things you're talking about here?
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting idea, a good idea. We wrote a paper in 2017, I think, called Social Wealth Fund for America, and one of the proposals in the paper was to have the government essentially borrow money and then use the money to build out a fund. The government can usually borrow at quite low interest rates, though not at the moment, I don't think. But for a long time, the government was able to borrow for 3%, 4%, whatever. But public equities generally return something like 10, 11% on an average year. So if you borrow money at 3% and you invest it at 10%, you can make the difference between those as revenue. And so it's kind of a free money type thing that takes advantage of the government's unique ability to borrow money that other actors don't really have. So that's kind of how they are proposing it. So I think that's a good idea. Now, I think you need to make sure that you distinguish this from efforts to turn Social Security into personal investment accounts and things like that. Now, as I've read the proposal, that's not what it looks like. It looks like it's just a fund. There's no personal accounts that people have in the fund. It's just kind of like a moneymaker, a revenue generator for Social Security. And I think you also need to make sure that you don't give the fund off to, say, Wall Street to manage, because then they're going to extract fees out of it that are going to cause you to lose revenue that you don't want to lose. So don't give it to BlackRock. Don't give it to Vanguard or State Street. You can manage that fund in-house publicly. That's how Alaska does it. They have a public asset management company that's state-owned that runs their social wealth fund. That's how Norway does it. So, there are ways that they could screw it up, but the general details that I've seen so far look good to me.
Matt, let me ask you about both Alaska and Norway, because their social wealth funds are both backed by oil revenue. Now, obviously, over the medium to long term, we want to wind down fossil fuel extraction. So how do you avoid, in those instances, if the revenue that's coming in is based on this thing that you ultimately want to wind down, how do you avoid sort of entrenching fossil fuel production forever if this is funds that, the public depends on and that they ultimately benefit from?
Yeah, so what's actually happening in those cases is they are, in a way, reducing their dependency on oil as a revenue source. Because what they do is, when the oil gets pumped out of the ground and then sold, they take the money and they put it in the fund. And then that fund goes out and buys assets like you would see any fund buy. So they buy up stocks and bonds and real estate and whatever. And then it's only the return on those assets that they use to finance spending in Alaska. They give out a check every year to people. So it's only the funds from the stuff they're invested in. So the way they'll describe it is they're converting oil into stocks and bonds. And stocks and bonds live forever. The oil does not live forever. So you could cut the oil production out of Alaska and Norway tomorrow, and the funds would continue to generate income into perpetuity because they have essentially converted the oil into stocks and bonds.
So when I have a conversation with somebody on the right, or when generic lefty X has a conversation with somebody on the right, if you bring up socialism, the sort of knee-jerk reaction is like, or communism, bring up socialism or communism, you hear like, well, what about Soviet Union? That was a disaster. Or, they bring up Venezuela as the go-to for a lot of people on the right, or Cuba in some instances. And usually the response from a lefty is like, well, that's not real socialism, or that's not real communism. Number one, do you buy that? Number two, what would your answer be when talking to somebody on the right if this is how they react when you bring up socialism or communism?
Yeah, what people like to do with this, of course, is they want to label countries that they don't haven't done well. They want to attach socialism to that, and then if a country has done well, they want to attach capitalism to it, or vice versa, right? So it's a kind of a jockeying game, right? So I wrote a piece actually a while ago when people were talking about Venezuela when it took its dive recently, and I believe the piece was titled something like Norway is Venezuela on steroids or something like that. If you look at what Norway and Venezuela are very similar countries in terms of how they are composed. They both have a lot of oil. The oil sectors make up something like 13 to 15% of their GDP, depending on the price of oil on any given day, I guess. And they had state-owned oil companies. The Venezuelan one was PFDSA, and then Norway we have Statoil. And so they're, to the extent that they are socialistic, they're structured, similarly. The difference is that in Norway they use their oil revenue to build this huge fund, which now uh, controls something like 50 to 60% of all the wealth held in the country is owned by this fund that
Wow.
came initially from oil. In Venezuela, they just spent the money, immediately. And so when the oil price fell and collapsed, Venezuela sort of fell and collapsed. When the oil price fell and collapsed in Norway, they drew a little bit of money from the fund, to kind of patch things over, and everything was fine. So it's just really kind of how you manage it. It's got nothing to do with like state ownership of oil or state ownership of oil companies, because we see both countries have that, and both countries have similarly sized oil sectors, but one managed it well and one didn't. So
As a follow up to that, what do you make of the response from people? Like when I think of the problems with, say, Cuba or Venezuela, two things pop into my mind: the embargo and sanctions, and the authoritarianism are the two things that pop to mind when I think of, like, hey, why have some of these countries gone off the rails a little bit? If you get rid of the sanctions, get rid of the embargo, whether it be on Cuba or Venezuela or both of them, and you limit the sort of authoritarian nature of, say, Fidel Castro's government with crackdowns on the media, et cetera, I feel like that would sort of, the countries would thrive a lot more. Is that a fair analysis, or are there things I'm missing?
yeah, I think, it's hard to disentangle a country's economic performance from what one of the major superpowers is doing to it, right? And that's a problem you have across the board, whether the country is nominally socialist or capitalist. If the U.S. is not happy with what you're doing, it finds ways to undercut you. We actually saw this. We're seeing this right now with China. I don't know what exactly you want to call China at this point in terms of its economy, but the U.S. in the last year has taken measures to basically make it impossible for China to produce semiconductors in the country, just as a kind of economic warfare kind of thing. And it did that for Cuba for so long. If Cuba could run an economy similar to some of the other sort of island nations over there, it would probably have a big tourist economy and be a much richer nation than it is. As far as authoritarianism goes, yes. I mean, I would say personally, like definitionally, socialism is incompatible with authoritarianism because socialism is meant to be control of the society generally. So if you
Yeah.
have an autocrat at the top that's not democratically accountable, then I don't count state ownership by an autocrat as socialism. The state owner needs to be accountable to the people for it to count. So that's sort of a definitional move. But the
Yeah.
other thing is, and again, this goes back to just how people want to characterize different things. When a country is autocratically capitalist, we don't say what that means about capitalism. Like Saudi Arabia or Russia post the fall of or before the fall. Like Russia is not less autocratic than it was before the Soviet Union fell. But now it's, essentially capitalistic in the way it's structured. So that happens in any kind of economy. And so, the evil is the authoritarianism. It's not who happens to own the shares of the companies.
If socialism is definitionally incompatible with authoritarianism, is capitalism definitionally incompatible with democracy?
Capitalism is definitely incompatible with democracy, at least as it's defined, it's I would say maybe incompatible is the wrong word. Capitalism does not make it necessary, does not require that the ownership of the economy be democratic. It allows the ownership of the economy to be held by a very small group of people. In the United States, the top 10% of people own 75% of all the wealth. When it comes to stocks, it's which represent ownership shares in company, it's even more concentrated than that. And that's what you've tended to see in like Western capitalist societies, where we have data where we can measure these kinds of things, is that the ownership and control of the productive enterprises tends to get concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people. And there are reasons this happened that are just inherent in the way that the system works, where money begets money and the rich can get richer because of the way investment returns work. So capitalism, I would say, is very open to that and does tend towards that outcome, and doesn't seem to see that as a problem.
Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.